It seems like a lot of people view the Hunger Games franchise as little more than the basic model for the YA dystopia genre, but I think they deserve more consideration than that, so here I am. Today I want to talk about this franchise, give my thoughts on each of the movies, sure, but equally focus on how they build on each other, change over time, and generally handle the story that the series overall is telling. That's what I'll be doing every video, actually. That was my clever way of introducing the concept of this channel. Anyway, video essayists always have relevant props, so there's a bow.
I volunteer! I volunteer as tribute!
The Hunger Games isn't a perfect movie, sorry for the most hack review line ever, but it is a perfect product in that it does everything it needs to do to kickstart the series. It sets up its world admirably quickly. Text just spells out what the Hunger Games are, and when we follow Katniss through her town, it's easy to see that it sucks and is in stark contrast with the flashy interview in the Capitol that we opened on. There's a clear class divide and the games are the center of it. Done. Got it. Not to go all comrade here, but this ease of setup is largely thanks to the audience's understanding of their own society. Like, we see the Capitol 1%ers above the exploited workers, and just inherently get it. And get that it's wrong. Sorry, Capitol. Is. On that note, I love how much the film leans into the grotesque tackiness of the Capitol fashion and decor. I'm sure the producers were tempted to tone things down, it is all quite silly, but by just going for it, they gave the franchise a huge chunk of its identity. Also memorable are my incredible transitions, and the impressive cast. Donald Sutherland, Woody Harrelson, Elizabeth Banks, and of course Stanley Tucci all leave a really big impression and help flesh out the world with relatively little screen time. I also think Josh Hutcherson gives an underappreciated performance as Peeta. His demeanor is totally different from Katniss's, as is his approach to their situation, and that leads to interesting clashes between the two as they prepare for the games. Also, I just think he's very likable. Hashtag Team Peeta, I guess. Katniss herself is a very strong protagonist. This genre became so infamous for having these bland leads that anyone could project themselves onto, but that is not the case here. Her initial motivation may be broad, she wants to save a loved one, but she still has unique internal problems, more on that later, and makes interesting choices, like the superb beat where she shoots the apple in front of the judges. This early character groundwork is important too, because it ensures that her identity doesn't slip too much in our minds once she becomes a more reactive and straightforward heroic lead during the games themselves. Speaking of Katniss and Peeta and Gale... Oh, there's also Gale? Sorry, he's barely in this one, but he does matter to the series overall, so... Shout out to Gale?
Brother of Thor.
I'd like to point out that this is not a love triangle movie. There's no tension over which cute boy Katniss will choose. In fact, when Peeta makes his televised love confession, A, it affects the actual life and death stakes of the story, and B, Katniss is like mad about it. Another great character moment. I will say that the third act focus on this quote romance is a bit off tonally, even if it is meant to be understood that Katniss's reciprocation is mainly for show. Regardless, I like how the film uses its unique premise to deliver this unique interpersonal tension. This leads into what I find to be the most fascinating aspect of the Hunger Games, both movie and franchise, arguably its signature theme, the manipulation of public perception. The form that takes here is Katniss having to learn to be marketable and play to the crowd in order to get help in the games, and it works because it's character-driven. Katniss really isn't likable, she's abrasive, but that makes her interesting and makes sense. She's had a bleak life, and her struggle to just drop all that after being thrown into the glittery Capitol totally tracks. This element actually plays even better now than when the film was released. You know, young people crafting audience-pleasing personas in a desperate attempt to get attention and claw their way to success in a cutthroat environment. Please like, share, and subscribe.
TikTok, okay.
Anyway, let's get to the child killing. The various perils that Katniss has to overcome in the games aren't terribly creative, but there were enough moments where she had to make strategic choices that I never got bored. The abundant use of shaky cam has always been the biggest criticism of this movie, and it's definitely a problem, but it doesn't bother me much in the action scenes where it's motivated. It throws me mainly in the first act, where it has no reason to be doing that. I also think that the movie is pretty over-edited, an issue that feels like it comes from the same artistic mindset as the shaky cam. The last thing I'll point out is how naturally the Hunger Games sets up its sequels. It's basically a self-contained movie. I mean, sure, the tyrannical government isn't dealt with, hence the sequels, but our hero gets into trouble, overcomes obstacles, and gets out of said trouble. The franchise-building aspect comes about very organically. Katniss, through her understandable actions, unintentionally becomes a point of concern in the eyes of the Capitol. And that's it. There's no chosen one, she doesn't try to be the hero, we don't even get a big post-credits stinger. We just end on a single shot of President Snow, who's clearly concerned that there may be trouble ahead. And thanks to a great box office return, he is correct.
Katniss, when you're in the arena, remember who the real enemy is.
I'm not going to beat around the bush here. The burning bush, I suppose, praise be. I think Catching Fire is phenomenal. One of the best blockbusters of the decade, an improvement on its already good predecessor in literally every way. The first upgrade you're hit with is just the general filmmaking. They've dropped the washed out aesthetic, the shots are rich and often gorgeous, they've dropped the shaky cam, and they've dropped the frantic editing. An increased budget is also very much on display. Beyond greatly improved CGI, we see more of the world, more stuff happening in the world, even just putting more extras around, it all makes the scale feel a lot bigger. And the stakes grow to match. Katniss has already been traumatized by the events of the first film, an affliction I call sequel SD, by the way, when she is threatened by President Snow, and having your hero and villain meet in person for the first time right off the bat sends a clear message. The gravity of the situation is reinforced by showing actual consequences when Katniss steps out of line, like when an innocent man is shot because she accidentally inspires him. This scene also drives home an important aspect of Katniss' character moving forward, and that is how horrified she is at mattering all of a sudden. I think this is one of the most relatable things about the character, and it really helps keep her, and by extension the entire series, more grounded. While Hunger Games was not a love triangle movie, Catching Fire is, and I admit that the triangle part is weak. Katniss' relationship with Gale is just not given enough time here. I mean, he wasn't given enough time in general last movie, so it falls flat. However, I think the Peeta side does work. Katniss having to sell their faux relationship so people don't see her as a rebel is brilliant, but hot take, I like the romance in its own right. Maybe I'm just a sucker for an unrequited love story, but I feel really bad for Peeta in the beginning as he suffers the sham of what he wants for real. I like that Katniss develops feelings for him because of his genuine support, loyalty, and kindness, and I was happy to see them kiss for real. Hashtag Team Peeta. I will say that Gale gets more screen time here, and gets a bit of an identity as a more gun-ho revolutionist ready for conflict, and this feels like a role that needed filling, and is a good contrast to reluctant hero Katniss, even if that's really only featured in one scene here. Haymitch and Effie get improved roles too. Effie shows a clear emotional bond with the rest of the team, leading to some sweet moments, and Haymitch being less a dismissive cynic and more engaged sells me on having him grown close to Katniss and Peeta too. Enough that his final story beat, where it's revealed that he betrayed Katniss by saving her and not Peeta, lands well for me. The new characters are endeared to us with the simple trick of having us theoretically want to root for them, even before we're told that they're good guys. Finnick is cocky, but in a fun way, and he loves his kind old lady. Too bad he's an enemy. Oh, he's not. Cool, I like him. Joanna is aggressive and fearless. She seems rad. Too bad she's an enemy. Oh, she's not. Cool, I like her. Plutarch is, well, played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, so cool, I like him. He is great in this. I love his inscrutable, low-energy charisma. The PR battle is in full swing now, and it is once again what I find most fascinating about these movies. The Katniss Peeta love tour I talked about earlier is a huge part of this. What was just a ruse to get sponsors in the games is now the only thing keeping their families from being executed, and apparently the entire country from erupting into all-out war. The first act thrives thanks to this dramatic through line, and I love the creeping sense that it's already too late, that what's happening is way too real for the reality show nonsense to stop. I also love that we see the villains strategize how they should play things on their end. It's fun to see bad guys lose their grip, it emphasizes the danger Katniss is in, and it makes this theater of the conflict more two-sided. It feels like, as Plutarch says, moves and counter moves. Though I will say, the Capitol allowing the tributes to speak freely on a live broadcast is... that's just asking for trouble. I mean, you cannot be mad when Peeta pulls a Roxy on you.
I wouldn't have any regrets at all. If it weren't for the baby.
Baby?
This brings us to the games themselves, and if I'm allowed one CinemaSins ding, yeah, it makes no sense that the characters seem to be learning about the Cortiquel at the same time we are, but whatever. These games are better. Fireballs are so last year. Now we have acid fog, birds screaming in the voices of tormented loved ones, a washing machine. I would trade the monkey set piece for another melee with human combatants. The film feels a little lacking in that area, but overall, it's an improvement. The other thing that makes these games interesting and not feel like a total repeat is the mysterious rebellion subplot running just beneath the surface as they try to get Katniss out of the arena. I like the breadcrumbs spread throughout, like Finnick having Haymitch's bracelet and the Morphling sacrificing herself for seemingly no reason. It's fun to be out of the loop alongside the characters. Removing this agency from Katniss doesn't harm the film though. For one, her status as an ordinary person in extraordinary circumstances would be compromised if she was in on the plan, but more importantly, this approach plays on her inability to trust people, which leads to great tension now that she's in a group dynamic. Putting her in a group was also smart because we saw her in lone wolf mode last movie. That's basically the concept of the games, and it's no longer novel in movie 2. The fact that the supporting cast are all adults too also helps things feel less gimmicky. All of this was the right way to go. This air of distrust builds to the climax, which I admit is a bit rushed, but I still think it's very effective. Having Snow's efforts to ruin the public perception of Katniss collide with her trauma-fueled trust issues as she has to choose whether to shoot Finnick or not is very thematically neat and leads to a gorgeous sequence when the dome comes down. On paper, Catching Fire does share basically all of its narrative concepts with Hunger Games, but since all those elements have been either improved or expanded upon, I don't see this as the first film being retread, but rather perfected. That being said, I do think it's for the best that, as that last shot made quite apparent, the franchise cannot turn back from here.
Are you coming to the tree?
Mockingjay Part 1 is rougher than I remembered, but before I get into how the Part 1 part of Mockingjay Part 1 kinda ruined it, there are other issues. I think Katniss's broken headspace is underwhelming. It's obviously realistic that she's gotten worse, but it still feels like just a more dour repeat of Catching Fire's beginning, and an emotional retcon of its ending. I also don't like how PETA-focused she is. I know I commended her for being a reluctant hero earlier, but I still would have liked to see her agree to help for reasons bigger than saving her boyfriend, even if I am invested in that relationship. Conversely, I'm still not at all interested in her relationship with Gale. He at least acknowledges in this movie that they don't have a real romance, but that doesn't excuse the half-hearted execution. And while we're on the topic of these three, Katniss not going with Gale to get PETA in the climactic rescue mission is just so lame. The main character should be part of the climax. Finally, the movie's look is mediocre. Part of that is due to the overwhelming amount of time we spend in the dreary bunker city of District 13, but even outside of that, the cinematography is undeniably lesser than its predecessor. Alright, let's pause the negativity and focus on some strengths. With the revolution fully underway, the PR aspect of the series is now just literal wartime propaganda between Katniss and Snow, and this was the perfect place for it to end up. It's escalation, and also what this has been all along, finally out in the open. I appreciate how Katniss pushes back against the fake elements of her propos, that re-emphasizes that she's an authentic person, and when she does finally give a real speech at the bombed hospital, I buy that she's a leader. I also like the physical production aspect of this plot, the virtual set, and then the documentary team that follows her, but maybe that's just the film student side of me, aka my worst side. The Capitol using PETA as their mouthpiece is great payoff for him being captured at the end of Catching Fire, it makes things personal, and it is smart for Snow to utilize the biggest celebrity he has, especially when that celebrity can counter Katniss's influence specifically. For example, I love when PETA reveals that he and Katniss had nothing to do with the rebellion during the games. Like, that's true, it helps Snow's case, but it's true, I like that. Oh, and this is a minor detail, but the in-universe Mockingjay propaganda using the same font and logo as the film Mockingjay's real-world marketing is wild. And finally, if I may retroactively pitch a tagline to Lionsgate, they aren't playing games anymore, and we do finally get to see the war that has long been promised. A taste of it, anyway. Making the thought-extinct District 13 a military district was a clever way to enable all-out conflict right away, and framing this as the crucial moment to strike before momentum is lost sets the stakes well. I will note that there's something about this new Revolution mode that strikes me as YA in the cheap way every once in a while, but it is still satisfying and quite cool to see things like Katniss and Gale taking down some Capitol bombers. Too bad that happens 50 minutes in. There's just no shape to this movie, no momentum. I was going to argue that this isn't half a movie, it's more like one of those mid-season table-setting TV episodes, but upon rewatch, no, it is just half a movie. Yes, it has a great cliffhanger ending, a brainwashed PETA strangling Katniss out of nowhere is very shocking, but that does not justify the gratuitous meandering. I wouldn't call any of the scenes themselves terrible or anything, but the majority of them feel like either deleted scenes you watch once on the Blu-ray or chapters from the book that were rightfully deemed non-essential. Especially coming off the immaculately paced Catching Fire, it feels surreal to spend 100 minutes in a first act. Also bad. It feels bad to spend 100 minutes in a first act. I should clarify that there are some good sequences. The Hanging Tree Dam bombing is effective, the dream rerun of the Katniss Peeta Stay With Me scene from Catching Fire is actually really sweet. Katniss walking through the crowded hospital having no idea how to help really highlights the horror of not just war but leadership. There's good stuff in here, it's just all so far apart, and even non-pacing issues arise because of this. A very major new character, Julianne Moore's President Coin, makes her debut here, but she doesn't feel important because nothing important is happening around her. In fact, I forgot to mention the character in this segment until I was writing the next movie segment. And that's a problem. Mockingjay Part 1 has qualities, but they are painfully watered down, and as a result it is far, far less than the sum of its parts. This is honestly a good lesson in blockbuster storytelling. It shows that the strength of this kind of movie, what draws me to them anyway, is the constant stream of engaging ideas, whether that be plot beats, character beats, action beats, or ideally, all three at once. When you stretch those out and pace them like a much quieter, deliberate film, it's not so much that the cracks in the material begin to show as you begin to crack the material. Wow, look at that! The first episode of my show on franchise storytelling just so happened to facilitate a thesis statement on that very subject. What a coincidence! It actually was. Honestly, I just wanted to gush about Catching Fire. Well, Catching Fire and... As harsh as I just was towards Mockingjay Part 1, I do have to give it this: it enabled one hell of a finale. Just like how Catching Fire is an immediate filmmaking upgrade to the first movie, Mockingjay Part 2 looks and feels leagues better than its predecessor. I had a list of examples ready, but I realized that'd be tedious, so just trust me when I say that everyone clearly put their all into this installment and seemingly treated Part 1 as an afterthought, which, fair. Katniss is out of her funk, more or less exactly where I'd expect her to be emotionally after Catching Fire. True to her character, she isn't bloodthirsty or anything, but she demands to be put into combat, sneaks off to the front lines when refused, and then lies to turn her propaganda shoot into an assassination mission. Like, she is very active in this one and will not be excluded from another climax. Part 1 may have given us a little bit of warfare, but I think Mockingjay Part 2 is straight up a war movie. If this had been the box office success that the first two films were, I think the series overall would be more respected because it takes this seriously. It's all very chaotic and messy, in no way scrubbed clean, and the characters are never given an easy moral out. I mean, the third act begins with a group of civilians, specifically children and medics, being bombed twice, and it turns out the good guys did it. I also find the mix of aesthetics absolutely fascinating. You have imagery that invokes the sort of bombed out city you'd expect in a World War II film, but the design is that semi-futuristic YA look, and I think that's wonderfully unique. The second act, which takes place in the city, drags a little in a few spots, but nothing like Mockingjay Part 1. There is the correct amount of action scenes, and the quiet scenes have atmosphere, and reasons to exist. Okay, fine. Part 2's second act is really good even without the low bar. In particular, there's this stretch where back to back we get a great Katniss Peeta conversation, a masterfully suspenseful stealth scene, a pretty terrifying escape sequence complete with important character deaths, a barrage of relentless traps, all capped off with the final payoff of the Stay With Me motif. It is just A+ after A+. Here's where I have to pause to highlight just how much I love the idea of Snow littering the Capitol with Hunger Games style traps in order to slow and kill the rebels. Absolutely brilliant. I mean, it makes logical sense. In this world, there exists an entire profession dedicated to creating and implementing lethal wipeout courses, but far more importantly, it just feels so right to bring this iconic element of the series back in to play us out.
Welcome to the 76th Hunger Games.
Perfection. Unfortunately, this does draw attention to one major shortcoming of the movie, which is that the other half of the series' foundation, the propaganda stuff, is absent, having been more or less covered in Part 1. If Mockingjay had been one epic-length finale and included the propaganda from Part 1 and the citywide games from Part 2, it probably would have been the best film in the series. So I realized while editing that the public manipulation thing is here a bit. To maintain popularity, Coin takes credit for Katniss's rogue actions and then capitalizes on her assumed death, and the entire bombing climax is Coin trying to convince people that the Capitol did it, which counts, so it's here. I would have liked more. I still think Catching Fire is better, but strong silver medal. Going back to the war stuff, stop the presses, Gale is an important character now. We get a proper focus on how his role as an obedient soldier clashes with Katniss's independent nature, and he has a few cool beats where he gets to go classic action hero. And while I'm still a no on the relationship drama, I guess I cared enough to feel that absolutely ruthless wrap-up.
Goodbye, Gale.
I mean, he did design the ploy that killed her sister, but still, that's rough, buddy. Peeta is still way more compelling, though. I love seeing him as the opposite of his former self, not a sweet loyal friend, but a murderous liability. Katniss suddenly treating him with her trademark cold demeanor is brutal, and consequently seeing that melt away as he regains control of himself is compelling, and yeah, I am glad they end up together. Hashtag Team Peeta. Actually, let's dwell on the epilogue for a second, because a lot of people were upset that Katniss ends up with kids, and I understand the reflex to reject marriage to man and having babies as the de facto thing a woman should end up doing. I'm totally with you there. However, I do think there's a conversation to be had about how treating every female lead as simply a girl boss scrubs away any depth they may have outside of being cool, and I think this is a great example of that. The entire point of Katniss's character is that she isn't an action hero. Cool as she is in that role, that is never something she wants. We just saw her suffer through 4 movies of that. She's not a fan. Also, the topic of children did come up with Gale at the very beginning of the first film. She says she's never having kids, but that's explicitly in the context of their conversation about how broken the world is, so having her change her mind is a great way to communicate a happy ending. It means she's far more hopeful about the future and is at least somewhat at peace with the actions she took to make it that way, and I think that's a great note to end on, so sorry for the tangent, but I'm glad I addressed it. Now let's rewind. Minor characters get their wrap-ups with varying levels of success. Beetee just stops appearing, but I really liked seeing the cocky Finnick back. I didn't mention how dull he was in part 1, but he's fun here, just in time to die horribly. Similarly, Mahershala Ali's Boggs was actually introduced in part 1, but didn't do anything, which is a shameful waste of your Mahershala Ali. But here he has a good rapport with Katniss and a solid enough minor role, which is still a waste of your Mahershala Ali. Joanna gets a few scenes. I really wish she added up to more. Same with Haymitch, who's relegated to, oh no, we hadn't filmed that Philip Seymour Hoffman scene duty as his farewell. I am actually impressed at how well they worked around Philip Seymour Hoffman's death. I think Plutarch gets a commendably fitting wrap-up given the real-world tragedy, but maybe I'm being generous because I've always liked benevolent puppet master characters. Now at last, we need to turn to President Coin and the film's ending. To start, wow to the scenario. Katniss marching through the amphitheater, taking aim only to shoot not Snow but Coin, Snow laughing hysterically as he's swarmed and butchered by the crowd. It's all that special breed of franchise endgame imagery that so rarely makes it to the screen like this. I think it's spectacular. And amidst all this is the quick but wonderful wrap-up to the Katniss Peeta storyline too, when he knocks the suicide pill out of her hand right after. It affirms the sentiment Katniss expressed earlier in the film.
That's what you and I do. Keep each other alive.
But is also a great callback to the climax of the first film when they almost eat the poison berries. Another great bookend here is Katniss killing Coin primarily due to her role in Prim's death. Katniss only volunteered for the games to save Prim, she's where this all started, so ending with her death is darkly fitting, and each film did slowly move Prim towards her role as a medic, which, knowing how she dies, provided for some nice dramatic irony during my rewatch. As for Coin herself, like I said, she had a bit of a shaky start, but in the end the character comes together, and that's because her being the final twist villain of the series is, I think, very truthful to the ideas behind these movies. By having Katniss's simple, mostly unintentional actions be enough to eventually crumble Snow's rule, the series argues that oppression is an unnatural, inherently fragile, and inevitably doomed state, and therefore there's no real question of whether or not Snow will lose here. He more or less lost after the second movie, if not the first.
It must be a fragile system if it can be brought down by just a few berries.
Yes, it is indeed.
A lot of people thematically interpret Coin's death as a both sides thing. Snow and Coin, and by extension real-world politicians, are all the same, all bad. However, I think this reading misses what the series is specifically critiquing about both characters, and that's where my beloved public perception element comes in. Like Snow, Coin consistently manipulated the masses in order to achieve greater power, she just did it for the right side. Katniss's authenticity, her inability to do the same, is her original internal problem, and it persists all the way into the Mockingjays. She's clearly positioned as Coin's antithesis in this respect. They clash quite a bit in part 2 especially, and it's even revealed that Coin actually wanted Peeta as their mascot because she knew that Katniss wouldn't play ball. There's a scene early in the film where Katniss admits to a man with a gun at her throat that he has every reason to kill her. Her side just attacked them, it makes sense. She points out, however, that this violent cycle only ever harms those forced into conflict, never those above it. And this is where the war and the games come into play, and it is the overall point. I mean, come on, the Hunger Games are literally poor people pitted against each other so that they won't turn against the rich and powerful. Does that even count as a metaphor? Coin may be overthrowing Snow, but she bombed dozens of innocents just to strike a decisive victory to a war she had already won. Had she lived, the cycle would have continued. She even suggests hosting another Hunger Games just to drive this point home. Snow and Coin aren't the problem. The status quo that they built and benefit from is. And if I may put that into my own words, invest in guillotines. Or I guess in this case, invest in bows? The Hunger Games franchise is great. One greedy part 1 and a weak love triangle subplot does not ruin that. What starts as a well-executed what-if dystopia tale evolves into a gripping action-adventure saga with some simple yet true observations about how we are exploited in the binary society in which we find ourselves. It's a warning against empty rhetoric, arguably populism in general, and wants us to question not only those in power, but the very mechanics through which they achieve and maintain it, with our often willing help. In this regard, unlike most of its toothless imitators, the Hunger Games franchise is actually a tad revolutionary, and I really like it. So, if you're still watching, thank you for letting me talk about it for so long. If you had a good time, all likes, shares, subscribes, all that is unbelievably appreciated because this is square one. That's all I have. Sorry, I haven't figured out yet if I'm one of those creators who has to end on a poignant note, or if I can just